Dear respected teacher, dear noble community, today is the 9th of August in the year 2020. We are in the still water hall of the Dharma Cloud Temple, Plum Village. And we're also not in the still water hall of the Dharma Cloud Temple, Plum Village. We're also a little bit everywhere, all over the world. And it's wonderful to be together like this. I feel very honored today to have this chance to share. And I really feel the love and the trust of my brothers in the energy of the chanting and their presence here today. It's wonderful that we can do this together. So I don't feel like I have to give a talk on my own. I have all my brothers and sisters with me, and it makes it a lot easier. So last night, we heard some very powerful sharing from our friend Bill McKibben, as well as some young practitioners in our community. I hope everybody was able to enjoy that session. And I wanted to continue with some of the themes and questions that were evoked in that session. Something that Bill said, which I think is very powerful, is that the best thing an individual can do right now is to be a little bit less of an individual. So I hope we can look into that in this talk. How do we do that? How do we be less of an individual? We asked him to give us hope, because actually that was what the brothers and sisters in the teaching committee asked me to do today. They said, give everybody hope. So I just asked him, maybe you can give me hope, and then I can give everybody else hope, make it easier. And I think in the end his answer was very powerful. He said, in the face of the suffering that we now see in the world, it's very hard to know what we can do individually that would make a difference. It doesn't take much to be aware of the coming changes to our way of life that will be caused by rapidly shifting climate, and then all the consequences of that, knowing that parts of our world will become uninhabitable within a few years. It will get too hot to live, and that will cause mass migration of hundreds of millions or even billions of people. And that is almost inevitable now. It's almost too late to stop that change which is already underway. And that can be very scary, and we might prefer not to look at that. But I like what Bill said. He said we have to find a way to have the courage to look at it without blinking, to have the courage and clarity to see what's coming, and still to find hope, and to know what to do and what not to do. So whilst we may now see that individually it's hard to have any impact on a problem of that magnitude, his answer to give us hope was to say that, well, we know that movements of people joining together to act together in harmony have been successful in the past at facing such challenges, although we've never faced a challenge as big as this one. So I felt his answer was, form movements, join a movement. Let's make a movement of movements. Because we need many, not just one. But we can cooperate, act together in synchrony, in harmony. And that's the only way that we're going to be able to face this challenge. But why do we have hope? Because we know that actually, by coming together as one body, we have a lot of power, we have a lot of capacity to change the current situation of suffering. Right now, a lot of the world is still in the midst of the pandemic, whether we're in lockdown or coming out of lockdown, whether the numbers are going up or going down, everybody is still feeling the consequences of this global pandemic. And we've been forced to stop. Some people are calling it the Great Pause. And it can be a wonderful opportunity for collective reflection. There are those who are eager to get back to business as usual, to reopen businesses and get the economy working again. But we know that the economy, the GDP, is directly linked to our carbon and climate change gas emissions. So, as a result of the Great Pause, economic activity has reduced a lot, and we now know that if we all stop flying, if we all stop driving around, if we all consume less, then we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by about 5.5%. We just did that experiment involuntarily. We didn't have the intention to do that experiment, but it was kind of forced on us. We just had to stop. And now we can say, okay, if we all individually reduce our consumption and our travel, we don't fly, that's the impact, 5.5% reduction. But we also know that that's not enough. That 5.5% is not enough just to avoid what is called catastrophic climate change. That actually we need to reduce by about, I think it's about 7.5% per year. Year on year, every year, 7.5% more in reductions, just in order to stay around 1.5 degrees of heating, which is bad enough. So that means that going back to business as usual would be a catastrophic error, because as soon as we do that, the GDP goes back up, the economy goes back up, greenhouse gas emissions go back up. And not only do we continue to destroy our planet and our atmosphere, but we just go straight back to a situation that maybe wasn't bringing us so much joy anyway. We know by now that more consumption, more material wealth, does not correspond to increased happiness and well-being. There's a certain threshold, we need to have enough to get by, but increases in wealth above that threshold do not have corresponding increases in well-being and happiness. There's a lot of evidence for that now. And in fact, what we see is that by living in bigger and bigger houses and by isolating ourselves more and more, we destroy our communities. We feel more and more isolated, alienated. And we feel a kind of emptiness inside, a hollowness. So we know that that's not the way to happiness. So we have to take this opportunity of the great pause to find new ways. And maybe together today we can explore some of those new ways. So I often ask myself, what is this thing called Buddhism? Or what is this thing called mindfulness practice? Right? We're all supposed to be mindfulness practitioners, at least I hope so. That's the theory. And some of you on this retreat, maybe this is your first time, maybe this is an introduction. And some of you maybe have been practicing for many years already. But I think it's helpful to keep asking ourselves the question. So the first time I came in touch with this practice was more than 20 years ago. And I still feel like I don't know exactly what it is. And I think it's helpful not to know, because as soon as we think we know, then we stop learning. And we kind of stop being open to discovering something new. So right now, I want us to see if we can drop our ideas of what the practice is and maybe discover something new. So there is an idea kind of current in society right now that mindfulness has gone mainstream, and some people say that we're losing the essence. It's become mindfulness. And there's been criticisms that what if we're using mindfulness just to manage our stress and our ill-ease, our malaise, enough that we can continue to live in this inhuman way? What if we're just calming ourselves down enough and dealing with our anger and our frustration enough that we can just go straight back to work and continue the rat race and continue to be productive members of society? So maybe we have to be careful. Sister Dedication, Sister Hinyam yesterday spoke beautifully about not decontextualizing mindfulness, not dissociating mindfulness from the Noble Eightfold Path. So we know that when we teach mindfulness, it always has to be in the context of all of the other elements of the path, which includes ethics, which includes a kind of moral code, in a way. So maybe you signed up for this retreat because you were hoping just to have a little bit more calm, a little bit more space, a little bit more peace in your life. And that's good, that's already good, and the practice can certainly do that. But we want to encourage you not to stop there. We want to offer you the cream of the teaching, the deepest teaching available. And it might seem at first like the very deep teachings of Buddhism are sort of for advanced practitioners, that you have to wait a long time before trying them out. But our teacher has shown us that we can touch those deep insights right away. And in fact, maybe the less we know about Buddhism or the practice, the better chance we have to touch those insights, because we have the gift of beginner's mind. We're free from ideas and notions. And if we already have some ideas and notions, we can do our best to let them go. So we know that Buddhism talks a lot about suffering. That there is something called the First Noble Truth, which is the noble truth of suffering. And for many years, I think I misunderstood this teaching. As we know that Buddhism aims to free us from suffering. And in order to do that, we're encouraged to investigate and look into the roots of suffering, how our suffering has come to be, which is the second of the Four Noble Truths, the roots of suffering. But I think I misunderstood this second Noble Truth for a long time. I understood Buddhism to be, in a sense, a description of reality, a description of the way things are. And I thought that if I could find out what happened in the past that gave rise to my feelings of suffering in the present, and if I could understand that, those events, and see them clearly, then I would have realized the second noble truth, and I would be on the path of the cessation of suffering, which is the third noble truth. But I'm not sure now that that's really what the Buddha intended us to do, because I can look into the past and I can see what happened to me. Maybe some painful things occurred. Maybe we all have wounds of one kind or another. People have been unkind to us, or circumstances, just difficult life circumstances, maybe loss, the loss of a loved one. I lost my mother when I was 18. She died suddenly. And for a long time I thought, in a sense, that was a cause of my suffering. And now I'm not so sure. I think now that it's not enough just to know what happened in the past, because I can't change what happened. So even if I find out what happened, it still happened, and it was still bad and very painful. So how does that help? So maybe the what happened, the historical part of the bad things that happened, is not really the root of my suffering. Maybe I don't suffer because of what happened. And that's good, because if we believe that our suffering is caused by events and other people, bad things happening, whether now or bad things that might happen in the future or bad things that happened in the past, then immediately we're a victim. And we blame. And we feel powerless to change. We feel like we have to have a different kind of situation. We have to live in a different place or be with different people, and that's the only way to get out of our suffering. And it's not to say that there's no truth to that. Sometimes it's helpful to find a better environment that's more supportive to us. But I think what gives us more agency, more power, is to see that maybe the main root of our suffering is just our way of relating to what happened. Our way of relating to what's happening now. and our way of relating to what may happen in the future. So it's more about our ideas about what's going on, our perceptions about what's going on, or what has gone on in the past. And maybe the stories that we tell. The stories that we tell are very powerful, whether it's at the individual level or the collective level. Yesterday, Bill also spoke about the collective myth that we've lived with of individualism. He mentioned that Margaret Thatcher said, there's no such thing as society. There's only individuals. That's a story, but it's a very powerful story, and it has consequences. So what I want to explore is how stories like that could actually be causing our suffering. Because I think we know enough about the damage that we're causing to the earth that we want to stop. We love the earth enough that we don't want to harm her. And we know that if we harm the earth, we harm ourselves. And so I think we're intelligent enough to know that we want to stop. But why is it so hard? Why is it so difficult to stop? I believe it might have something to do with the things we believe about ourselves, about humanity, about our civilization, about life itself. The ideas and the stories that we have, that we tell ourselves, whether consciously or unconsciously, collectively or individually. We are shaped by these metaphors, by these stories. And they cause potentially harm. And if we could find maybe a better story, a better narrative, better metaphor, we might find a new way to live and a new way to cause less harm to our beautiful home. So that's something also Bill mentioned last night. A new metaphor could be more impactful, more important than a new kind of engine. So sometimes it seems like a metaphor is something not very powerful, it's just words, just an idea. But maybe if we look at the stories and metaphors that I believe are currently causing so much harm, then we can see how powerful these things are. So we might have a story also about Buddhism itself. There's a kind of popular understanding of Buddhism, which you encounter if you put on a robe and you shave your head and you go into a supermarket and people stop you and say, "Oh, do you believe in reincarnation?" And you have to breathe and find a skillful way to help the person understand, or just to maybe smile and offer that person your presence. So there's an idea that Buddhism is about this story of the cycle of samsara, cycle of rebirth. That if you are nice and you're a good person, you do nice things, then when you die, you have a chance to get reborn, to get reincarnated as somebody in even better circumstances, maybe a prince or a princess, or these days, I don't know what you'd have to be, a CEO, I don't know. I'm not sure that that's much better. Maybe you even get reincarnated as a god, and it's actually, Buddhism is quite, it's kind of sci-fi sometimes. You get reincarnated on other planets where the lifespan is thousands of years and everything's wonderful and everybody lives in harmony and bliss. And that goes on for a while, but after a while maybe your good karma runs out and then you get reborn again in a hell realm or in a place of suffering. If you do unkind things, you're not a nice person, maybe you get reborn as a mosquito, and then you have to suffer a lot and you have to suck people's blood, and maybe somebody who isn't a Buddhist slaps you and kills you, because a Buddhist would never do that, right? Yes, hope so. I always thought it's quite hard if you're a mosquito. Like, how are you supposed to be a good mosquito? Do you just sort of say, I make a vow not to suck anybody's blood, and then die? It's pretty hard to get out of that one. I'm not sure. I'm not sure where that goes. So we have that idea that, maybe we have that idea that Buddhism is about this cycle of rebirth and kind of figuring out the mechanism of rebirth. Like, why do we, what are the things that cause us to get reborn in less favorable circumstances, and how do we stop doing those things, and what are the things that get us to be reborn in wonderful, heavenly realms, and how do we do those things, and then maybe ultimately we are completely liberated from the cycle of rebirth, and then what exactly? I'm not sure. Anyway, it's supposed to be good. And in order to understand this cycle, we're supposed to get enlightened, but it seems like that's going to take 10,000 lifetimes, so it's quite complicated, quite difficult, and it's kind of like, I don't know if you know, there's this fusion project in the south of France called ITER, which is the International something. They're trying to make fusion workable to create power. And the thing they always say is, we're close, but it's going to take 20 more years to get workable fusion. And somehow it's always 20 years away. And I feel a little bit like that with this story about enlightenment too. It's no matter how many lifetimes you've been practicing, it's always 10,000 more. So it kind of just stays in the distance. So I'm not really sure that that's what the Buddha intended. Because actually when we look, we find that that story about reincarnation, rebirth, karma, all of that already existed at the time the Buddha was alive. In fact, it had been around for 2 or 3 centuries at least. We find the teachings of the cycle of samsara and karma and rebirth in the Upanishads in the 7th and 8th century BC. So the Buddha didn't come up with those. They were already there. So this is where I maybe say some silly things and get in lots of trouble. I'm not a Buddhist scholar. I'm doing my best to practice. So I could be completely wrong. I just advance this as a hypothesis. We'll see if it's helpful. I think the Buddha actually grew up with those teachings. And what he came to understand was that this story actually causes suffering. And he gave us a way, a practice, to be able to recognize and identify the roots of that story in our consciousness. And in order to have that story of the cycle of rebirth, you have to have a soul which passes from one body to the next, which is reborn, a self. And what he gave us is a way to completely uproot that idea of a self. So he gave us a way to recognize all the ways in which we live with that idea and all the ways in which it causes us to suffer, to recognize it in our consciousness, in our thinking, in our feelings, in our ways of interacting. And he gave us a way to remove that idea. And what he did not do is give us an explanation of reality to replace that one. He didn't give us another story. He didn't say, it's not like this, it's like this. And that's where I went wrong for many years, because I thought that he did. I thought that the story of non-self, of interbeing even, of impermanence, I thought that was supposed to be a description of reality. And now I'm not so sure. I think actually if you look carefully at what the Buddha said, if anybody ever asked him, is there a self or is there not a self? He stayed completely silent. He refused to answer. But what he did do was help us to see the ways in which this idea of separation, this idea of self, when it arises in our thinking, causes stress and suffering. And that could be at the individual level, because if we think that we are a separate self, then immediately there's a kind of fear that arises, and a loneliness. We're alone, we're cut off. And nowadays that story has become very powerful at the collective level. The story of separation, of individuality. The idea that we should just look after number one. Just take care of yourself because nobody else is going to. It's a dog-eat-dog world. In fact, maybe you even have to lie and cheat and steal, because if you don't, somebody else will. So you have to be competitive, you have to be aggressive, you have to do whatever it takes to win. And some of us may have grown up with those ideas, consciously or unconsciously. I know when I first came to Plum Village, the thing that really stopped me in my tracks was this idea that it's possible to live a life of service. It was extraordinary to me. Nobody had ever talked to me about that before as a life choice. Everyone would say, what do you want to do with your life? What kind of career do you want to have? What kind of job do you want to have? But living a life of service was never one of the options. And it really struck me when Tai would speak about that. When he spoke about aspiration, that we might discover within us an aspiration to help those around us, to help our society, to help even other species, the planet, to reduce suffering. And that could guide our entire life. That was a powerful new story for me that I hadn't encountered before. What I had encountered in my education was, I believe, the consequence of several ideas. So one, these are kind of dominant myths in our society, like survival of the fittest. So this is from the theory of evolution, that life is struggle, competition between species, and only the fittest will survive, only the strongest, the most aggressive. You have to dominate, and you have to be faster, you have to be smarter, because there's always somebody else out to get you. And I think that myth really influenced the whole of the last 150 years, at least. It may have been a dominant notion that allowed us to colonize other countries. Because social Darwinism then arose, which is the idea that maybe some human types, some races are stronger, better, and that we have a right actually to go to other countries and dominate other races, other cultures, because we're the strongest, and that's just natural law. We didn't make it up. Because I don't think a human being without that idea could do that much cruelty, that much harm. I don't think if we didn't have that idea driving us, that we could kill and exploit and extract resources from other countries, just steal. I don't think we could do that without that idea supporting us. And yet that idea continues in our consciousness until now. I remember when I was at school, we studied a book called The Lord of the Flies. And if you grew up in an English-speaking country, you might have also studied that book. It's one of the most the most popular books for people to study on literature courses, still now. And it's been translated into 30 languages, it's everywhere. And the story goes, it's about a plane crash somewhere in the Pacific, I think. And a group of boys, or maybe it's a boat, I don't know if it's a boat or a plane, I don't remember. Anyway, they crash. And there's a school group, or a group of English boys on the plane, and they survive, but the captain of the plane is killed, and all the adults are killed in the crash, but the boys survive. And they manage to make their way to a deserted island, and then they have to figure out how to survive, stranded on this island. And they come up with three, they immediately elect a leader, who's kind of the strongest, the most athletic, the most handsome. And he comes up with a plan, which is number one, have fun. Number two, survive. And number three, make smoke signals to see if they can get the attention of a passing boat. So anyway, things start to go wrong quite quickly. I won't go into the whole story. But in the end, they kind of become more and more violent and aggressive towards each other. And the initial organization, which is kind of democratic, gradually falls into a pretty dictatorial system. And the strongest start beating up the weakest, and three of them end up dead. And then when they're picked up eventually by a passing ship, the captain sees them all, naked and wounded and violent, and he says, "How could this have happened?" And then the leader of the bunch cries, and he cries for the end of innocence, because in the book this is presented as growing up, the realization that inside we are all violent, aggressive, greedy, savage beings. And that's supposed to be the take-home lesson from that book. And they teach this in schools. You need to let go of this innocent idea that we're good and kind people. We need to take on board this idea that actually deep down we're just out to look out for ourselves and we'll do anything it takes. We're monsters. I know when I read that book, it had a powerful impact on me. It was very hard to resist that story. It's very interesting, though, that the man who wrote that story, William Golding, he was a British school teacher, and he was depressed, alcoholic, and he believed those things about himself. And he believed that he was writing the story to help people understand what had happened in the Second World War, the Holocaust. So he was writing in the 60s, and it was an enormous question for everyone. How could it be that humans could behave in such atrocious ways? How could such cruelty be possible? The mass execution of millions of Jews in the Holocaust by the Nazis. How could they have done that? And if we were in the similar circumstances, would we do the same? So it was a kind of deep examination of what is our nature? What is our human nature? Are we really like that? And he said of himself, I understand the Nazis because I think deep down I'm the same. And that's the story that he wrote on the basis of those beliefs, of those ideas, and that we teach children. There's another story, a very powerful notion. It's almost like a mental model that we have for understanding environmentalism, economy. It's called the tragedy of the commons. This is the idea that if land is shared and it's not owned by anybody, but everybody has the right to use it. For example, pasture land for grazing cattle. In the past, in England, every village had commons in the middle, so an area which is not owned by anybody, where anybody can bring their cattle to graze. If they don't have land themselves, they always have somewhere where they can bring their cattle. And a man called Garrett Hardin wrote an essay in 1968 called The Tragedy of the Commons, in which he argued that if you organize land use in this way, the only thing that will happen is the degradation of the common land. It will gradually get depleted and it will be destroyed because nobody's managing it, nobody owns it, and you will think, if my neighbor takes his cattle to the best grass, then I won't have a chance, for my cattle to eat that grass. So I have to get there first. So you will assume that your neighbors are going to be selfish and greedy, and so you have to be selfish and greedy to get there ahead of them. That was basically his argument. What's interesting is that there was no evidence for this. None. And yet this has become a dominant myth in our society. And it's passed around in conversations. I remember at university people saying, yes, the tragedy of the commons, as if it was wisdom. But it turns out that this man, Garrett Hardin, was a racist, eugenicist, white supremacist, and Islamophobe. And what he was advocating was called lifeboat ethics, which basically means the rich should push the poor out of the boat, because if they don't, then they won't have enough. So he advocated stopping sending food aid to countries where there was famine. He lobbied the US Congress for that, because he thought if we help other countries, then there'll be overpopulation, they'll use up all the resources, and we'll all suffer. So he was actually advocating, take care of number one, close the borders, build a wall, just take care of ourselves, forget about everybody else. And this idea, the tragedy of the commons, has dominated environmental policy making and thinking for years. Until recently, when now people are going back to the original paper, it's still one of the most cited papers in the scientific literature, even though there's no evidence. And now people have gone back and they found that it is completely false. So there's an economist called Elinor Ostrom, and he won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for economics because of his work to show that actually humanity over the ages has known very well how to handle collective land and collective property. We have all kinds of human institutions and organizations to manage that without needing individual ownership and control. So it's the opposite. We know how to collaborate. We know how to cooperate. This story is completely false. The Lord of the Flies is very interesting because it turns out that this really happened. Something similar happened. It's a little known story that there were 6 boys on the island of Tonga who were in kind of a school they didn't like. They were bored and it was kind of, they were unhappy. So they decided to try to escape. And they thought they would borrow somebody's fishing boat and try to make their way to Fiji or even New Zealand. So they got a bag of coconuts and some water and a few other things, and they set sail in their tiny little fishing boat. But they got caught in a storm and got lost, and they ran out of food, ran out of water, and were really in danger when they came across a deserted island, but really just like a rock sticking out of the sea, not a very hospitable place. But they managed to make their way to the land, and we know what happened to them because they were rescued about 15 months later. They lived for 15 months on this island, completely alone, with no resources. And it's a question, what do we think would have happened? Would they just descend into savagery and rule of the strongest? Or would something else happen? It turns out the first agreement they made was never to quarrel, never to fight. And instead of the Lord of the Flies scenario, in fact what happened was that they immediately divided into teams of 2. They decided they realized they had to make fire and then maintain that fire. They managed to keep their fire alight for 15 months uninterruptedly because of good organization and skillful cooperation. They ended and began each day with singing and prayer. These guys were just 16 years old, 15, 16 years old. When one of them fell off a cliff, he broke his leg. And instead of leaving him to die, they climbed down, risking their own lives, managed to figure out a way to pull him back up. And they looked after him for weeks when he was unable to help. And one of them said to him, "Don't worry, just sit there, you can be like the king, you know. We'll take care of all your work and we'll look after you." And they just took care of each other. And when they were finally rescued, they were healthy, happy, and they had unbreakable bonds of friendship that lasted their entire lives. And we only know this story because the captain who rescued them got to know them, and I think he may still be alive in his 90s, and the boys themselves are now in their 70s, and most of them still live together. So it's completely the opposite of Lord of the Flies. That is who we are. And we need to tell each other, we need to remind each other, we need to change the stories we tell in our schools, what we tell to our children. I want to tell one more story, which is about, which was told by Margaret Mead, who's a very famous anthropologist. And one of her students asked her, what can we identify in the archaeological record as the beginning of civilization? And the student may have expected her to show a pot, or maybe a burial ritual, or some kind of tool, or something like that. But instead, she held up a human femur. It's the longest bone in the human body, from the knee to the hip. And maybe when she first held it up, people thought, "Oh dear, this looks like a weapon or violence." But she showed them that this femur had a fracture in it. And she said that when the femur breaks, without modern medicine, it takes at least 6 weeks to heal. And in the wild, if you're on your own, you will die. You can't survive. But what was clear in this bone, in the break, was that it had healed. You could see where the break was, and you could see that it had healed. And she held this up as evidence that the beginning of our civilization was when we started caring for each other. When the tribe or the group could get together and say, "We will carry you, we will feed you, we will look after you when you can't. When you can't survive on your own, we will take care of you. We will not abandon you to die. We won't push you out of the lifeboat." And that was true then, thousands of years ago, and it's true now. When the boy fell down the cliff, his friends looked after him. So we have to remember, that is who we really are. And this story that we tell in evolutionary theory about competition, survival of the fittest, also turns out to be mostly wrong. There's more and more evidence that almost all life on this planet depends in one way or another on cooperation. And not just within one species, but between species, between interlinked networks of species. This is known as mutualism, or symbiosis, interspecies cooperation. So we need to change the dominant myths of our society. We need to look again and recognize all the ways in which these ideas of separation show up in our thinking, speaking, and acting, and uproot them. And maybe on the way to being free from any notions or views about the nature of reality. We can borrow some of these other stories of cooperation and symbiosis and mutualism, to help us create a new kind of society based on the insight of interbeing, of interconnectedness. So yesterday, Sister Hinyam, Sister Dedication, ended with the Noble Eightfold Path, which is the fourth Noble Truth. And we had at the top right view. And we know that if we can come to an understanding of right view, if we can have the insight of right view, then naturally our thinking will be right thinking, our speech will be the right kind of speech, our action will be right action. We will know the kind of life we want to live, the kind of livelihood we want to have. We will know how to practice a diet of consumption, right diligence, taking care to water our good seeds and not to water our less good seeds. We'll know how to practice right mindfulness. And that right mindfulness will lead to concentration, which will support and generate the insight of interbeing. And you can start anywhere in that chain. And every element of it leads to every other. So what is this insight of interbeing? What is this right view? In the Katyayana Sutra, a monk asked the Buddha, "You speak all the time about right view, but what is it? What is it really, this right view?" And the Buddha said, "It is a view free from the notions of being and non-being." So that might sound like philosophy. And you might ask, well, what does that have to do with my suffering? The views of being and non-being. What's the point of that? How does that help? And that's good. You should ask. Ask yourself, what does this have to do with my suffering? So there are views, there are ideas that we can have that seem to lead to various kinds of suffering. And those views all come from a kind of ignorance. So, what kind of ignorance is this? It's the ignorance of seeing things as separate and outside of each other. So we get confused between the appearance of a thing and its true nature. And so this, we might have the appearance here, which could also be known as the sign of a thing, what it looks like. It might be a concept we have of it, a word. This in Sanskrit is the lakshana. So between the appearance of a thing and its true nature. Which is called the svabhava. Thank you. And in terms of Western philosophy, we know this as this is the phenomenal. It just means the world of things, the world of phenomena. And this is the noumenal. Which is the true nature of things, but it's hard to say anything about it. So, if I ask you, or if we ask a child to draw a tree, usually what you get is something a little bit like this. I don't know if it's going to look like a tree or a piece of broccoli, but anyway. Okay, something like that. Broccoli, tree? I don't know. Broccoli, okay. So, when we think of a tree, we might think of something like that. It's its appearance, it's how it looks to us, how it occurs to us. And we might also have an idea of a tree, which is a thing, an entity, which can be talked about. We can point at it, we say, look, there's a tree. And it's separate. But when we spend time in a forest, if you actually sit with a tree for a while and really look carefully at it, I think it's very hard to say where a tree starts and where it ends, where its boundary is. I'm not even really sure there is such a thing as a tree. Is there really such a thing as a tree? In the first Dharma talk, Sister Langniam spoke about how she was able to transform a feeling of loneliness by spending time in the poplar grove and breathing and feeling that breath that she was taking was the oxygen from the trees. And so in her very breath, she was intimately connected with the tree, interconnected. And we can all do that now. We can breathe in and know that this in-breath is the out-breath of all the trees and plants around me, and the plankton, the algae in the sea. It hasn't come from anywhere else. We humans didn't manufacture that oxygen. And so if we say that this breath connects me with the trees, then what is this me that I'm talking about? Where is its edge? Where is its boundary? Where is the tree's boundary? Because if I wanted to really draw the tree, I would have to include the air around it, because the tree depends completely on the carbon dioxide in the air for photosynthesis. It depends on the sunlight. It depends on the earth for water and nutrients, on the clouds. So I find it very difficult to find any kind of edge, any boundary, any place to say, okay, up to here it's tree, after this, not tree. Very difficult. And yet, it's our habitual way of thinking. It's the ignorance that gives rise to the notion of separateness. And we see things. Separate things. And because we see things, we also see birth and death. Because if I'm separate, then at some point I had to appear, I had to come into being. And at some point, presumably, I'm going to die. And that in itself is kind of a source of suffering for a lot of us, a source of anxiety, fear, uncertainty. We know that no matter what we do in this life, we can't take anything with us. And we all somehow want to know what happens when we die. I remember Tai would get that question all the time, even though Tai always teaches about no birth, no death. People practice for many years, and they listen to many of Tai's talks, and they go, okay, yeah, I get it. Cloud, in the sky, no coming, no going, no birth, no death. I get it. But Tai, what happens when we die? Just tell us. So we somehow don't accept it. We don't accept these ideas of no birth, no death. It's the idea of birth and death is so deeply entrenched in our mind. And it may actually be because of this idea. The idea that we are a separate entity, identifiable, that we have a name, a passport, a birth certificate. Say, this is me. But we have to look more closely, to really examine it. We ask, what happens when I die? But we could ask a similar question, which I don't think many of us ask. What happened before I was born? This is actually the equivalent question, right? Because that's, in theory, after I die, I cease to exist. But before I was born, I also didn't exist, right? So, what happened before I was born? And then you have to see, well, okay, when was I born? And this inevitably leads us to the idea of run out of space here. Of being and non-being. So we can imagine time on this axis, and there's a point where we're born and a point where we die. And here we are in the realm of being. We exist, right? And after this, we die, well, we're supposed to not exist. So this is the realm of non-being. And before we were born, we also didn't exist, so that's also non-being. And the idea is that this ignorance about our interconnection leads directly to this idea of separate things existing outside of each other, which inevitably leads to the idea of birth and death, which has within it the ideas of being and non-being. And so we suffer. But we have to I think it's each of our responsibilities to investigate, what does this really have to do with my suffering? Where can I detect this idea in my thinking, in my speaking, in my way of acting? Do I agree that this has something to do with my suffering? Because you don't have to take anybody's word for it. You have to examine, look for yourself, find out if it's true. But as long as we are in this realm of being and non-being, then we go round and round in the cycle of samsara. And we suffer. And this is a teaching which is based on the teaching of the 12 nidanas, the 12 links of interdependent co-arising, which Tai very compassionately simplified for us. He said, you don't need 12, 5 is enough. So he made it much more simple for us. And so if this is the teaching of Buddhism, then is this a teaching about the nature of reality? Is it telling us something about the way things really are? Is it saying that this cycle of samsara is real? It's very hard when somebody comes to you and tells you about no birth and no death when you've just lost somebody. So my mother died when I was 18, and I came to Plum Village shortly after, and Tai taught about no birth and no death, and I just struggled so much because I thought, but look, like, she died. Don't tell me she didn't die, right? I mean, I know where she's buried. There's a little box full of ash. So how can you say that there's no death? It took me a long time to understand that that is not what Buddhism is saying. What it's saying is that if we can remove our idea of death, our idea of birth, our idea of being, and our idea of non-being, then we have a chance to see things as they really are. Buddhism doesn't say almost anything about how things really are. It just says, if you can remove these notions, then you're free to see reality as it is. And so there's the possibility of the 6 links of wisdom. So we have wisdom about the clear seeing about the nature of interconnection of all things. And then what we see is not things, but formations. And this is a really interesting word. And we've already heard in the other talks how the flower is made of only non-flower elements. And we have to train ourselves. It's a way of seeing. It's a way of removing the idea in our mind that this is a separate thing, this is a flower. Instead, we have to train ourselves when we look at this flower to see the sun, the clouds, the rain, the earth, the gardener, time, space. And so what we start to see is the possibility of a gradual path of training to remove these ideas of separateness. And we might borrow another story along the way, which is the story of interbeing. But ultimately we have to release even that story and be free of all of these notions to see it as it really is. And this is called the wisdom of adaptation, a gradual path. So we want to go from this ignorance, seeing things as being born and dying, understanding things as either existing or not existing, to a kind of freedom from these ideas. We see that things are interdependent and composed, and then we see that they're not really, we're free from the idea of birth. We're free from the idea of death. And we're free from the views of being and non-being. And we have a chance to go from the world of phenomena the world of things outside of each other, separate from each other, to the world of noumena, where we see everything inside of everything else, interconnected. And there's a gradual path to get there, which is the insight of interbeing. So this is a training. It's a way of retraining ourselves to see. It's a way of, first of all, recognizing all the ways in which we are telling ourselves that things exist separate, outside of each other. We have to do the work. We have to investigate. See the ways in which those ideas of separation actually create sorrow for us, and sadness, loneliness. They also create jealousy, competition. If I believe I'm separate from you, then maybe I should only take care of myself. Maybe nobody else really can understand me. And it's a very bleak world. It's a potentially meaningless existence. And we can be ruled by these stories of competition, jealousy, and we feel like life is a constant struggle. And we have to fear. We fear for our future. We fear for our death. But we have a chance now to to create a new kind of society where the dominant stories that we tell are stories of cooperation, of interdependence. And there are so many examples now that we have to explore this. If we come back to our tree, we might ask ourselves, when does the tree die? When does the tree go from the state of being to the state of non-being? And we know actually that there are many trees in the world that seem to be, in a sense, eternal. We can't find any point at which they die. Although the main trunk may die, underneath, when we look beyond the sign, the appearance, we see deeper. We see that this tree has roots. And for many trees, when the main trunk dies, the roots do not die, and another tree springs up. And maybe many other trees on the same roots. And although they look like separate trees, they're actually all connected under the ground. And maybe there's a sense in which we are like that too. We look like we're separate. But when we're able to look more deeply, as we did yesterday, looking into our hand and seeing, whose hand is this? This is my mother's hand. This is my father's hand. It's the hand of all my ancestors, human and non-human. When you look at the wings of birds and even the fins of fish, they all have the same basic structure. This hand contains within it the whole history of life on this planet. And those roots connect us. We can't see them. They're somehow hidden. And if we stay on the level of the sign, the appearance, we look separate. You could draw a line around me and say, this is Phap Linh, and everything else, not Phap Linh. But try and find that boundary for yourself. Try and find it in space, and try and find it in time. As we take this breath, do I say that this air that I'm breathing in is not me, and then at some point it becomes me, and the air that I breathe out was me and now isn't me? Or maybe I have to draw a bigger bubble around myself. Okay, this is Phap Linh. Not just this, but this plus this. But what about food? What about ideas? What about my education? My parents, my ancestors? All of that somehow is me too. And my actions. When I speak, even when I think, a gesture of kindness, are those things not me? Or do they actually continue me? So I think we get very confused by the sign, by the appearance. We look at this and we say, this is a person. But maybe there's no such thing as a person. And maybe that idea is what the Buddha was trying to help us remove. And remember, he didn't propose an alternative theory. He didn't say, instead of a person, there's something else. He just said, take away that idea and you will see for yourself. So it's wonderful because there's a little bit of work involved. At some point we have to practice, we have to train, we have to examine, we have to look at our way of seeing, unlearn our way of seeing things as separate outside of each other. But after that, if we can remove that, then what is revealed is love. Without any extra effort required. You don't have to try to love. If you take away that idea of separateness, what is revealed is our nature. And we can't say much about it. But I believe that we all have the chance to discover for ourselves that when we take away those ideas of separation, what we find is kindness, compassion, concern for each other. We find peace. We find freedom. So, we know also that these trees, at first we might think, okay, so this tree is the mother tree, and then there are children of that tree, and they are all on the same rootstock, but it's one species, right? So one species still has to compete for light, for air, for water, for space, with other species, right? Survival of the fittest, that's the metaphor. But this is also completely wrong. We now know that 90% of plants on Earth can't survive without the extensions to their roots, which are offered by this partnership with fungi. So there are mycorrhizal networks, I hope the translator has that word, which are these very, very fine filaments that run under the ground. And what we've now learned is that these filaments, first of all, the tree completely depends on them. The tree cannot draw enough water up into its body with only its own roots. It relies on other species of fungi, which are much finer, to deliver most of its water. And so already we have to kind of start to break down our idea of what a tree is. It's a partnership. And we know that plants only got onto land thanks to this partnership with fungi. So 500 million years ago, there were no plants on land. And algae managed to come out of the sea and get a foothold on land, but they didn't have any roots of their own. So for tens of millions of years, these plants depended completely on fungi for their root systems. And it took them tens of millions of years to evolve their own roots, and even then, they still depend on these mycorrhizal networks. And amazing research recently, in the last 30 years, has shown that these networks actually connect not just between the same species of tree, but between multiple species of tree. They connect the whole forest. And this is now known as the wood wide web. So, why do they connect to each other? How come these trees are cooperating with trees from a different species? And what could we learn from that as human beings, who are so concerned with the fate of human beings only? Well, it turns out that the tree has a better chance to live and to survive if it's part of a forest. And so, in a sense, there is no tree. There's only a forest. We know that these mycorrhizal networks can pass nutrients, they can pass carbon. When one tree is getting too much shade or doesn't have enough nutrients or is sick, other healthy trees can pass nutrients to it. And it's more than just carbon and glucose and nitrogen. It's genetic information, all kinds of different molecules. We're just touching the tip of the iceberg. We don't really know, but it seems like the trees are talking to each other. And so we have to be humble too. We have to be humble not to assume that we're the only ones who are aware. We don't really know what life is. We don't have a good definition of life. And it's very easy to say animate matter, inanimate matter. We're conscious, we have higher consciousness, ability to think and communicate. And somehow animals, well, they just have instincts. Plants, they're like furniture, it's kind of scenery, background. Rocks, definitely no consciousness, just, it's just the stuff you stand on. But that's a story, that's a view, and it's a view which allows us to destroy and to extract and to pollute the earth. So we have to change that view if we want to get out of our current situation of suffering. We need a new story. And I believe this story of interbeing can help. If we can start to think like a forest, not as individuals, but as just an interconnected part, a manifestation of the wider tapestry of life. If we can start to think like that, if we can start to see like that, to remove these ideas of separation, it might not be the ultimate truth, but it's on the way to the ultimate truth. It's a training. It's a path of training. And it helps us to function as a community. We know that we need to learn how to cooperate. We need to learn how to work together, how to put aside our differences. We need to know how to listen, how to overcome our disagreements, how to forgive, how to let go of hurt, anger, to stop blaming others, to stop being the victim. And what this path of practice offers us. When I asked initially, what is this thing? What is this thing that we're doing? What is this practice? What is this Buddhism stuff? I believe this is what it is. It is a path of training for us to relearn how to see. It's a path of training for us to relearn how to live together in harmony, how to work together. And that's what we do here in Plum Village. We train community builders. And I think we all need to be community builders now. This is the only way we can face the challenges that we face as a species. We know that the scale of the problem is too big. Individual action is not enough. We need to come together. And how? With the insight of interbeing, by retraining ourselves. And we can do that in our daily life, by the way that we contemplate our food. Every time we put a morsel of food into our mouth, we have a chance to let go of the idea of separateness, to see our interconnection with the whole cosmos. It's a practical daily training when we walk on the face of Mother Earth. We can ask ourselves, am I alone? Am I separate? Am I cut off? How could I even be walking without this planet? How could I be walking without my ancestors? There is no point at which I came into being. in which I was not. We can't find that boundary in time. If there had been any point in the chain of all my ancestors at which the process of life was interrupted, I wouldn't be here. It's an uninterrupted stream of transmission. So it's a project. And it's a wonderful project because it can also lead, I believe, to a new era of discovery. A kind of cultural transformation. Science sometimes seems to say that it's got everything figured out and now we're just working out the details. But I think we have to be more humble. I think all the biggest problems still are to be resolved. We still don't know what is matter. No clue. Ask a physicist. They'll have to tell you, they don't know. What is time? What is space? What is consciousness? What is life? Somehow, all the biggest questions are still utterly mysterious. But that's wonderful. That's the good news. And we have a way to remove all the ideas which are getting in our way that stop us from being in touch with that essential mystery. We have a path of practice and we have to celebrate that. We've found a path. And we have brothers and sisters and friends to support us on that path. And it's a complete path. It's amazing. We have the 5 mindfulness trainings. We have the 14 mindfulness trainings. We have ways to resolve conflict. We have ways to listen deeply and to use loving speech, to learn how to communicate with each other. We have ways to apply the teaching in schools. We have ways to apply the teaching in business, in the workplace. The potential for the transformation of our society is incredible. I think we could have a new era of art based on the insight of interbeing. We need the artists to help us understand. We need them to draw better pictures, not broccoli. We need filmmakers, we need musicians, we need architects, we need political theorists, scientists, writers, poets. If you think that everything has been done already, that all we have is the recombination of old ideas, this is the kind of postmodern picture, it's very depressing. But it's wrong. It's not true. There is so much that we can still discover and learn and create. There's so much beauty possible, whether that's at the level of community organizing or the level of artistic expression. All of this is still possible. So we know from the history of science that paradigm changes happen, sometimes with just a few exemplars. You don't need to change the whole theory. You don't need to understand how every little bit works. All you need is a few good examples, a few good stories to tell, and the whole paradigm can shift. And so we need to tell each other those stories. We need to find good examples that illustrate this insight of interbeing. And not just at the level of theory, of ideas, but we have to tell each other, what is our experience? When have we been able to touch it directly? When have we been able to drop our notions of separateness and get in touch with something more mysterious, something more wonderful? The noumenal world. And sometimes it's just an encounter with a wild animal. Because they don't have all these ideas of separateness. And sometimes in their eyes, when you look into the eyes of a deer at dawn, something happens. There's an electric shock. It wakes you up. And you have a chance to see how human your world is. How much we live in these confining stories and ideas. And for a moment, it can drop. And we get in touch with real life. So I've gone long over time. I apologize, but it's hard to fit everything into the last talk. We're supposed to do no birth, no death, and all of that. It's a challenge. But I think this is a story of hope. And we can have hope. And this transformation of our idea of separateness transforms our own individual suffering and the collective suffering. So we have a way, we have a path. But we need you to help us to invent it, to draw it, to paint it, to tell it. We need to co-create this new story. So, I think according to the theme of the retreat, there is no way to love. Love is the way. And I think that love is effortless. When we can remove these ideas of separation, what is there is love, without any need to struggle or try to learn something. It's just there, given. That is our nature. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for practicing with us, for participating in this retreat. It's such a joy to go on this journey together, and we look forward to continuing with you in many ways, whether online or in person or in the ultimate. Thank you so much. Let's enjoy the sound of the bell.
Thank you, Brother Phaplin, for offering the last talk of our retreat. So dear friends, just like every other day, during the time when you see it is most suitable for you, please continue with nourishing mindfulness by the practice of walking meditation. And then we shall have lunch, and this afternoon activity online will be at 2:30, total relaxation, and then our last Dharma sharing in our families. And this evening at 8 o'clock France time, we shall offer a very special event. We call it music meditation as a way to close our summer retreats. We have been very fortunate to have the conditions to offer 5 online retreats, and Love is the Way is our last one. And in our community, we have also many talented musicians, so we've thought of a way to celebrate our events. So we would like to offer music meditation, and we warmly invite all of you to enjoy and participate with us at 8 p.m. our time in France. Thank you very much. So with the next sound of the bell, please stand up and bow to thank and express our gratitude to our to Brother Spirit for offering the teaching.